On today's show, we have our guest, David Kola, and we're going to be talking about the topic of abortion. And is there any attachment or leads into eugenics? We're going to try to talk about this topic in a very honest and non-biased way, and we hope to explore both sides of the argument. David Kola?
Well, of course, things like abortion have been around since human beings have existed.
Yes.
And the one thing that is so striking to me about it, and particularly about that debate as it developed when I was young, I mean, my generation is the generation that ushered in abortion as part of the medical system in this part of the world. One of the things that was so striking to me about the debate, or lack of it, in the 60s is that people were, on one side, people made vigorous arguments about a woman's right over her body and what have you. How can you argue with that? I mean, it's an amazing situation to carry a child and give birth to a child. On the other hand, the argument was made that the child, the womb child, needs to be protected and come into the world. What was so striking to me, Derek, about it is how little compassion existed in the debate. You know, anyone who has had anything to do with abortion or known anybody knows that this is, the vast majority of times, this is an enormous tragedy.
Yeah.
And seems to me it calls for compassion more than it does to anything else. Now, you wanted to link this, or you were wondering if there was some connection to the development of eugenics.
Yeah. Like example, in some countries now, the rate of Down syndrome has gone way down to almost non-existent, because many women are being encouraged, if their baby tests positive for Down syndrome, that they should have it aborted.
Now that is also in and of itself a tragedy, and one needs to be alert to that. And many would say it is a tragedy to have a child that's born with a serious disability. Down syndrome is a curious one, because I've known a number of people that had Downs.
And they tend to be a very peaceful, gentle people.
And remarkably happy. And I've known families where this was the case as well, where there was a real struggle when they found out that this was likely to be the case, and would not, after 20 years of that child growing up in that family, they of course found it difficult to imagine that they could ever have any other kind of family. So what does that say to us? And one must be careful about how far we reach with this, but the one thing that it makes really clear to us, I think, is that when it comes to human beings, there is no model of perfection. All of us are different.
Yes.
All of us have different kinds of gifts, different kinds of potentials and skills. And we all have what, in the normal scale of things, would be considered deficits. So my sense is that being a human being is to have this kind of enormous variety. And the human society, it seems to me, human society is enriched by this variety. Now, one could argue that if there are certain diseases that can be detected in the first few weeks of of the development of the fetus, that we now have the capacity to correct some of those.
Yes.
Well, I think that's remarkable. That's one of the remarkable aspects of our medicine. And how could one not say that was good? Of course, I think that is good. But it's quite another thing to say, as some have argued, that we also can manipulate the human genome so we can bring forward, the designer baby.
Yes.
Or we can bring forward the super athlete or the person with extremely advanced form of intelligence. That kind of perfection, that notion of perfection, is to my mind unbelievably dangerous.
Like, to me, it makes me think you're almost living vicariously through your future child. We're going to genetically engineer this person, and that's going to be my kid, who's going to be the captain of the football team, the chess champion, and the math wizard, all thrown in one. It's almost like you're going to vicariously live through that person. It kind of reminds me of the Nietzsche's
Ubermensch.
Ubermensch, or the Overman.
Yeah, although I don't think that's what Nietzsche was talking about myself. But you make, I think, a very, very interesting, and it's a spiritual point that you're making, that the relationship between parents and children is of the most intimate of all human relationships, obviously. And the stance of the parent in relationship to the child is terribly important. I know of people who have never been blessed by their parents, and the hole that they have in their heart as a result, and the tragedy of that. I know of some who have never been blessed by their parents, but have been blessed by somebody else, and as a result, they are able to flourish and be free of that early spiritual deficit in their life. But what you're pointing to is that one of the dangers is that if you think you are manufacturing the child, that places you in a position where you are treating your child as a product. I always bristled a little bit when I heard people speaking to a couple, when are you going to make a baby? That kind of talk has always struck me as being so lacking in the mystery and wonder of birth.
Yep.
And being able to have a real living sense of the mystery and wonder of birth, no matter what the birth is. Because all of it is a mystery and a wonder.
Yep.
That really speaks to a particular kind of disposition towards the child and towards other human beings. It's a disposition which holds the mystery there, and as a result, it holds possibility there. The possibility for surprise, the possibility for the new, the possibility that I will learn all kinds of things too from the child, even if the child has particular kinds of challenges that we have to address.
I mean, Beethoven, he himself was bipolar. Albert Einstein.
You have to look long and hard to find an artist that isn't,
I mean, Albert Einstein, if he was alive today, same with Tesla, they would probably be tested, and they probably did have autism. So the question is, you can also see this. If we're aborting people with Down syndrome, are autistic people next? With such an attitude towards a human being, could this carry on into adult life or to our seniors?
How could it not?
Like, for example, that senior is getting a little senile. that person is kind of, they're getting older, or they have developed a physical disability, or maybe became an amputee, or just developed a disease. I mean,
If you think there is some kind of perfect model,
yeah.
then of course you walk into this trap.
Mm-hmm.
I remember thinking back in the 60s during the debate, the sort of public debate about the development of medical abortions as part of the healthcare system. I remember thinking, you know, my generation has brought that about. We will also usher in physician-assisted death,
Yes.
which we have now done. Now, why is that? Well, on one side, part of the argument is that there are certain cases where all of these acts, abortion, physician-assisted death, where the argument is made that there's something in this that is less harmful than what also might come to exist. That's the argument. The danger in it, of course, the grave danger in it, is that it can bring about, as you have been pointing to, it can bring about this attitude towards life which has notions of ideal in it.
Mm-hmm.
And if that ideal isn't reached, then it is somehow discardable.
Yes.
Now, my own sense is that, well, these arguments are made on both sides. I think it's very rare for people to approach abortion as if the fetus is discardable. And equally, it's going to be rare. We now have had well over 100 physician-assisted deaths in Alberta. It's going to be equally rare for there to be an assumption that this is just discardable.
Mm-hmm.
But despite that, the attitude, the possible attitude that can begin to develop is dangerous to not cultivate. And here I think is the real issue. To not cultivate, to assume we cannot cultivate a way of living with difference, a way of living with limitations, a way of living with suffering, and even living with dying. So I'm not going to be a kind of absolutist on this.
Mm-hmm.
On the other hand, I think they have both come about because within our society in general, we have lost what I would call the art of suffering
mm-hmm.
and the art of dying. And by the art of dying, I don't just mean physical death, I mean letting go of our ideals.
Mm-hmm.
Seeing that our ideals are not the way life is necessarily going to be, and being able to open our hearts and our minds to something that appears less than ideal and something that's going to pose a struggle for us, and to engage in that struggle. The tragedy here, Derek,
mm-hmm.
is that religious people,
Mm-hmm.
instead of trying to help cultivate that
Mm-hmm.
capacity in human beings, instead of doing that, they got on their moral high horses
Mm-hmm.
and they reduced the argument to something that very few people would agree with. And then they did all the lobbying work they could. And that's a tragedy.
Yeah.
But despite all that, the horse has left the barn. We have things to do around this. And what we have to do around it is, certainly from my perspective, is we need to enter into solidarity with people when they're in these periods of extraordinary crisis.
Yeah.
And we need to also be in solidarity with them as all of us learn to live with our limitations and with our struggles in life.
Yeah.
And that will make us richer
Mm-hmm.
and deeper human beings than any notion of the perfectibility of a human being.
Well said, very well said. But I just want to add, I think, an argument. I was looking into the doctor-assisted suicide or end-of-life care And I came across this one story. I do respect, and this builds on what you've said. I mean, I do respect some people are truly suffering. They're towards the end of their life, and they're suffering immensely. But on the other hand, I did come across a story of a rugby player somewhere in Europe. He was in his 20s, he became injured and became paralyzed from the waist down. And he made a decision to end his life through doctor assistance. But the truth of the matter is, as horrible as that injury was, I mean, he could maybe try to become a DJ or maybe start writing software. Just because his athletic career was over, I mean, that was his whole entire value. He was this great rugby player. I mean, did anyone try to encourage him to develop new skills, new abilities? And the truth of the matter is, with modern medicine, I mean, maybe we can cure, paralyzed people, who knows, maybe in 10, 20, 30 years from now. But this individual was thought, because he could no longer be that athlete, his life had no value, thus no meaning.
Yeah, but this is not particularly different from the struggles all of us have. Mm-hmm. When we realize that we have limitations, when we realize that some of our dreams are not going to be fulfilled, mm-hmm. when we realize that what we thought we were building or creating in life doesn't turn out to be quite what it was. So this is a central spiritual struggle. Mm-hmm. And it is significant from my perspective to reflect on the degree to which religious traditions, virtually all of them, but certainly the tradition you and I stand in of Christian Orthodoxy, it's preoccupied with this issue. Mm-hmm. And it's preoccupied with it because it sees it as a central human issue. How do we as human beings come to live a full life present to reality?
Yes.
Instead of a life of pain and sorrow because we cannot live up to some kind of abstract notion of what is appropriate. So in the Orthodox tradition, we like to talk about the ways of imperfection, yes, as opposed to the ways of perfection. That is, the issue is how to become attentive to the limitations that we have, not to be burdened by them, but to see that, those limitations are also a gift. It's interesting to me, we didn't really say much about the eugenics issue, but, here in Alberta, we had a eugenics program that was started.
And you were saying earlier, both the right wing and the left wing political parties at that time were actually a part of this?
Yes, well, there was a lot of interest in eugenics in the late 19th century,
yep,
and then into the 20th century. And in our part of the world here, the eugenics program existed under the social credit government,
yep,
which of course was run by two Baptist clergymen, mm-hmm. Bible Bill Aberhart and Ernest C. Manning. And it was really pushed also by the Famous Five and many people in the United Farmers and CCF party. So,
who were the Famous Five?
The Famous Five were the women who did all of the enormous work to see that women could get the franchise, could vote in Canada. So we have statues of them, and mm-hmm. we honor them in so many ways. But one of the curious things about them, and they were influenced, some of them were influenced by progressive notions of Christianity. They were influenced by the social gospel movement and what have you. So they had a strong social justice concern. But what happened here in Alberta is that this policy mm-hmm. of seeing that you didn't allow so-called defective people to be born,
yep,
which was the term they used. I mean, first of all, just think of that word. That's an amazing term to use, especially if you're a Christian. Because yep, if you're a Christian, you don't see anybody as defective. Everybody is the image and likeness of God, no matter what their condition, no matter what their intelligence, no matter what their behavior. They're all the image and likeness of God. So what is that saying? That is saying that every human being is the bearer of a mystery that participates in the divine. So what happened is that women would come from, many of them from East Central Alberta, Ukrainian farmers, and they would come to the Royal Alec Hospital. They may have had a couple of children, or they may not have had any. They only speak their homeland language. They don't know much about the system that's taking place. And in many of these cases, or at least more than ever ought to have existed, they end up having their tubes tied, or they end up having their capacity to give birth destroyed in them. Well, that was born out of a notion that there's only certain kinds of people who should flourish in the world. Well, it is the equivalent for the human genome. It's the equivalent of developing hybrids and destroying everything that the hybrid is based on. If this isn't the most dangerous thing you can do, we know that now in agriculture and in forestry.
Oh yes, it's
a terribly dangerous thing to do because the hybrids don't have the capacity to resist certain kinds of things or the capacity to reproduce in the same sort of way. So,
you mean hybrids or thoroughbreds, or?
Well, in both cases.
Okay.
I mean, when you develop a very sophisticated form of the species,
okay,
and then do away with
having very selective
the basis of that.
Basically, selecting for very selective traits.
Yeah. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean, I don't know enough about this, that I'm not making an argument that some selections shouldn't take place when it comes to agriculture and what have you. I am saying that if you do this to human beings, you turn human beings into objects. And when you turn human beings into objects, it seems to me you're doing the work of the devil.
Yeah, but it's also quite possibly the biggest eugenics movement. I mean, if you look at Nazi Germany, for example. I mean, if you look at Hitler and most of the leaders of the Nazi movement, they didn't actually live up to the Aryan ideal. I mean, he had dark hair, for example. He wasn't tall. Like, I always found that very fascinating. But yet, they continued with this hypocrisy.
Well, that's because it's a fantasy. And it's a fantasy that people hang on to and want to impose on others. And I had relatives who were in Germany during the rise of the Third Reich. And one of my relatives was a doctor and had a big house, but also, of course, was involved with the German military, which was a kind of requirement. And I suspect at some point, probably some of that family also was sympathetic to what the Third Reich was trying to bring about. You have to remember that Germany was put in a terrible position at the end of the First World War.
Yes.
And so some of those issues needed to be sorted out. But the approach was unbelievable. So in this particular case, I know that there was, in the extended family, there was a child that was mentally slow.
Yep.
And
but still functional or just slow?
Well, functional, but slow.
Okay.
Quite slow. And they knew that this child, if the authorities got a hold of this child would be euthanized.
I've heard stories like that.
So they brought that child into the doctor's house, because it's a big house, and the child lived there throughout the war, because they knew the doctor had authority. And they knew in the doctor's house this child would be left alone. So it's not, and I'm sure many examples of this occurred within the inner circle of the Third Reich. But we are facing a whole new issue here with genetic medicine, and try to deal with and develop a sort of culture of judgment around this. What's appropriate for us to do, and what is inappropriate for us to do?
Mm-hmm.
My own sense is that where you have poverty,
Mm-hmm.
and where you have cycles of poverty,
Yep. Yeah, if
and
you
where-
consider 'em-
where possibilities for the future are awfully thin,
Yep.
you contribute to people looking for alternatives to survive.
Mhm.
So my argument is this: you don't think abortions are good? I don't think they're good either.
Mhm.
So okay, let's see that people don't take that choice. And they don't take that choice if in fact they have a sense of hope, a sense of future, and if they have solidarity, and if they have the ability to bring children into the world and to love them and to see them flourish. So it's disingenuous from my point of view for people to be on their moral high horse about this and not be contributing to the public conversation and to the actual work to see that those who are not fortunate can flourish.
Yes.
We need to see that those who have not been fortunate can flourish. And if you're not willing to do that, and if you're indeed supporting political decisions around our commonwealth, our public commons, which are against that flourishing, then you may be pro-life, but you're not really pro-life. You are simply pro-life in that narrow circumstance, and you are not pro-life for the future of these people in this community.